So now we've basically proven that incumbents can have their jobs for as long as they want. If they want to stay in office, they basically have a really, really good chance of doing that. And so we also talked about the idea that some of these are structural in nature and they're very hard for us individually to change. And then we also talked about the disincentive that we, the people, actually have in throwing the bums out. And so it is such a difficult one that if people really are concerned about the idea that Congress isn't doing, that the members of Congress aren't representing us in ways that we would like, and if we have a system of legislative supremacy where the engine of our political system is at the federal level, the legislature, and it's not really doing anything consistently. And in the next lecture, we'll actually prove that and talk about that. Then maybe we need to have a different solution. And some people have turned around and said, well, the only solution we can think of is to limit the number of terms in office a member of Congress can serve. So people have sort of thrown their hands up other way to do this because the advantages that politicians create for themselves are so powerful. The ways in which they have connections with interest groups and wealthy donors to be able to get the money advantage. And the U.S. Supreme Court has turned around and said people can spend as much of their own money as they would like, that there can be independent expenditures done by interest groups and wealthy individuals. And so that can't be a solution. So really the only solution people have turned to is to say we should have term limits. And it is done at the state level. Since 1990, in Prop 140, California instituted at that point the most stringent term limits. And they said that in the California Assembly, they have 2-year terms, and in the state Senate, it's 4-year terms. And what they had in term limits, and we the people supported this in the Proposition 140, is that there would be a maximum of 3 terms that a member of the California Assembly could serve, and 2 terms in the California Senate, which means that a maximum of 6 years in the California Assembly and a maximum of 8 years in the state Senate. After that point, you could not seek re-election. Some people argue it's a violation of the basic freedom, the liberty, the freedom to choose whomever we want, that people should be able to vote for their incumbent if they would like, that members of Congress, or in this case the members of the state assembly, should be able to run for election and re-election as many times as they want. But the voters in California were so upset with the way in which the California legislature was working that they decided to impose these things. We also have, and it has recently been changed. People argued that there might not have been enough time to be able to create the expertise that is necessary to be an effective legislator. And so we changed it. So now it is a maximum of 12 years that any one individual can serve in the California legislature. But if they want to, they can serve it in one of those, a total of 6 terms in the California Assembly if they would like, or they could serve 3 terms in the California State Senate. And that would give them time to develop the expertise that's necessary to be effective. But it is still a limit in terms of the total number of years they can serve in the California legislature. There are limitations that are placed on governors, so that in California it is a 2-term limit in terms of how many terms a governor can serve. It's done for the President of the United States. It was a constitutional amendment. The 22nd Amendment was passed to limit the president to 2 terms and only 2 terms. I'll let you do the math of what you think about that in terms of what happens with the 2020 election and a 2-term Trump president, but the maximum number of terms that he or anyone else can serve is 2 terms, total of 8 years. There are some problems with this solution. There usually are. At the federal level, as we saw, you've got term limits on the President of the United States. Term limits require a constitutional amendment. The U.S. Supreme Court has weighed in and said the framers of the U.S. Constitution had put some requirements on what you need to do in order to be President of the United States. They put some requirements of what you need to be able to run for Congress, and at no point did they say anything about term limits. And the framers of the U.S. Constitution could have limited the number of terms, but they chose not to. And so, if we want to have term limits, it needs to be a constitutional amendment. And we know what that means. It takes 2/3 of Congress to limit themselves so that they no longer can serve in as long as they would like. So that seems unlikely. It can take 2/3 of the states to propose the amendment and then 3/4 of the states to ratify. But it's really, really unlikely for that to pass. And so that is a huge hurdle in terms of imposing. The other one is that some people have argued that simply saying that things are bad, and they may be really bad, they may be pretty bad having incumbents win so often. But that's not the same thing as saying that the cure is actually better than the disease. Some people have argued Just as we talked about in Federalist Number 10. The idea is you could get rid of factions by getting rid of freedom. If there's no freedom, freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom to petition, if you get rid of freedom, you're not going to have any interest groups. So clearly North Korea doesn't have any interest groups because they don't have any freedom. But the cure is worse than the disease. And they argue that this might be possible. As bad as it might be, as bad as Congress might be, with the system that we have of incumbents winning at such a high rate, that in fact things might actually get worse. It's hard to know why that would be, although we do have a way to look at that. The idea of federalism is that we use little laboratories. And you had some examples in California. And some people argued that there were some negative outcomes to having such strict term limits. And one of the big ones is that the members of the state legislature didn't really have the expertise. They weren't in Sacramento long enough to develop expertise that's necessary to write good legislation. The only ones who did have that expertise were interest groups who were continuing to lobby Sacramento. Even if there are new members of the state legislature, the lobbyists might have stayed the same. So interest groups had, but they're not elected. We don't hold them accountable. They're not necessarily doing things in an unbiased way. And the other ones that had expertise were bureaucrats. The bureaucrats of part of the California state bureaucracy had real, had institutional memory and could kind of control the lawmaking process. But again, we don't hold them accountable in ways that we can with our elected officials. So again, I don't need you to know or need you to believe a particular way of whether term limits are a good thing or a bad thing. But again, it's thinking about the pros and cons of each of those.